This is Truth Be Told.
That not only are there reptilians here,
new evidence of UFO fleets.
We were close to nuclear war.
To help you transform so that you can live your highest truth.
We're not being told just because we're not ready for it.
Radio stations of frequency, vibrational.
I was a homicide detective with LAPD.
UFOs increase. Visitations. Welcome back to another episode of Truth Be Told. Today we're going to Egypt, and we're going to be talking about the first female pharaoh of Egypt. And I'm excited to have back with us author Andrew Collins to talk about his new book, The First Female Pharaoh. And I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Sobekneferu, goddess of the seven stars. And so we're going to dive into her reign and her achievements, talking about the political and religious issues of her age, the temples and the ruins associated with her. And I'm so excited to have this gentleman back to talk about his latest book. So please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios, back with us again, author Andrew Collins.
Hi.
Hey, Andrew, how are you?
Happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. It's been a while since, I think the last time we talked about, I think it was Göbekli Tepe, your book. So now we're in another location of ancient history. So first of all, did I say the name correctly? And if I didn't, please change it for me there.
Well, I'm sure there's a debate over exactly how it should be sounded, but I just look at it in terms of two words: Sobek, which is the crocodile god of ancient Egypt,
right,
and Neferu, which means beauties or beauties of.
Oh,
so it's Sobekneferu.
Well, we don't normally, a lot of us, we usually talk about Cleopatra and Nefertiti. So why, being the first female pharaoh, why haven't we heard much about her and her reign?
Well, I mean, obviously, as you say, the most famous of the female pharaohs is obviously Cleopatra.
Right.
But we also have Nefertiti. There's evidence that she ruled for a couple of years on her own. We've got Hatshepsut, who was a very famous pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. And there are a few other, very incredible women that also took the reins of Egypt at certain points. But the reason why we've not heard of Sobekneferu is that her reign was essentially suppressed. And the reason why it was suppressed is because immediately after it took place, and she only ruled for 4 years, but her influence was around for an awful lot longer before that. But immediately after, well, not immediately after that, but certainly two, maybe 3 generations after her reign, Egypt fell to these incoming warlords from Canaan, who we refer to as the Hyksos. Some people refer to them as the Shepherd Kings. And this was the culmination of events that had been going on in Egypt for almost 100 years. Because, I mean, her father was a very famous, very successful pharaoh by the name of Amenemhet III, and he reigned for about 45 years. And, he achieved great things. But what happened was that after his rule, his son, quite a young man from what I can ascertain, who went under the name Amenemhet IV, he ruled for about 8 to 9 years. And during his time, the policy in Egypt changed slightly to allow the borders of Egypt to almost become totally open. And what this allowed was Semitic peoples to come in from Canaan and settle very heavily in the area of the Nile Delta, and all the way down to what we would today call Cairo. And I mean, a lot of these Semitic peoples took up jobs on every level, right, basically, whether it was in the army, the navy, whether it was, household, whether it was as engineers working in, engineering teams and things like that. So they were quite prosperous and quite successful. But some of them achieved even greater standing than that, becoming what appears to be court officials, firstly under his father, but then under this young king. And quite clearly, that he was being influenced by the people that have been around for decades, literally. And what seems to have happened is that various people, various factions in Egypt that would seem to have been nationalistic in nature were looking at this and thinking, if this continues on, Egypt's going to fall. And so I think what happened was that they went to Sobekneferu, and Sobekneferu was a younger daughter of Amenemhet III. When I say younger, I mean she was younger than her sister, whose name was Nefertari, which means the beauties of the god Ptah, who was a creator god. But she was going to rule, but somehow she disappears. I think she was going to reign jointly with her brother Amenemhet IV, but she vanishes mysteriously. And Sobekneferu, either officially or unofficially, reigns with her brother. And I think that they reigned essentially as man and wife. And certainly for the first few years, they were, quite tight. Their rule of the country was probably quite prosperous. But then something goes wrong. And I think it's around this time that people start coming to her and saying, look, something's not right in the country. We will support you if we get rid of your brother, essentially. I'm putting all this in simplified terms.
Right.
But, the evidence is there, within the text, within what we know about these reigns, within the architecture, within the archaeological remains. And she basically turned around and said, okay, let's do it. And that her brother was then killed. Now, whether she was directly or indirectly involved in this, I don't know, but I'm 100% certain that she knew what was going on. And so she then takes control of the country for 4 years and changes everything. She closes the borders. She asserts her authority very heavily. What I mean by that is she sort of says, look, I'm in control. I am the power. You accept my rule. You accept my ways. Otherwise there's going to be big trouble. And also she stopped trading outside of Egypt because up to this point there had been an awful lot of trading, particularly with the Sinai, because this was a major source of income of things like metals such as copper, turquoise, malachite, which were very important to the economy of Egypt. But she felt it was so important to shut the borders that she actually stopped all of this. And at the same time, she seemed to have initiated a separate dynasty, one that would follow on from her own reign. And the first two kings of this, who were probably very, very young, probably no more than, early teenagers, if anything, are somehow related either to her or her brother. Some people suggest that they could be the sons of her brother. Others that they may be the sons of her and her brother,
right?
Although there's absolutely no evidence that that's definitely the case. And she sets them up to begin the next dynasty. Now she is at the end of the 12th dynasty. They become the first kings of the 13th dynasty, and after she dies, they rule, and they begin a period of uncertainty in Egypt. Because it's quite clear that things are already starting to go wrong.
Right.
For the simple reason that they weren't now the only people to rule in Egypt. Another dynasty had been started in the north of the country, in the Nile Delta, which comes to be known as the 14th dynasty. And this is known as the Semitic dynasty because various of the kings there were, descended from Canaanites, so they were of a Semitic origin. And they were at loggerheads very clearly with the 13th dynasty. So the two were at loggerheads, and they almost certainly came to blows on many occasions. But very gradually, the Egyptian dynasty started losing its influence and power and had to go to the south of the country, to Luxor, where it ruled. And there it stayed for a period of time. And there was this sort of truce, really, where the two dynasties got on with each other. But what happened in the north of the country is that the kings of the 14th dynasty opened the doors again to everybody coming into the country, and this included these warlords called the Hyksos, and they then took over and they created their own new dynasty, which was the 15th dynasty. I know this gets confusing. You don't have to remember all of this, but it's all in the book.
Yeah, I didn't write it down, so hopefully there's no quizzes.
And then it gets even more confusing. Well, we'll forget the 16th dynasty, which we don't even know much about, basically, but the 13th dynasty, the patriotic Egyptian dynasty, gives way to the 17th dynasty. And they too are very clearly still loyal both to Sobek and to the memory of Sobekneferu. And they eventually rise up against the Hyksos. Two brothers by the name of Kamos and Amos rise up. They create an army, and it goes up against the Hyksos, and they drive them out of the country, creating not only the beginning of what's known as the New Kingdom, but also another dynasty, which is the 18th dynasty. Right. And of course, this 18th dynasty is one of the most prosperous in the whole of the country. And, you have all kings like Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and then eventually kings of the following dynasty, the 19th, such as Ramesses II, Seti, and things like this. So in other words, the empire of Egypt basically begins in earnest at this point. And if it had not have been for what Sobekneferu did, Egypt would have fallen. There's no question about that at all. And there's a good chance that it would eventually have just become another city-state, like many of the others in Canaan, basically. It would have had no power of its own. It would have come under the control of whatever, ruling power was there, whether it be Babylon or Assyria or whatever. And Egypt would have been lost, and our world would be probably completely different. I mean, not least of all, we wouldn't have had Art Deco, which came about because of the reign of Tutankhamun and the discovery of his tomb in 1922. So, in other words, everything around us could have been different if it had not have been for Sobekneferu. But the thing is that after her reign, once it came to the 18th dynasty, certain things become apparent. Firstly, wherever she's buried has now been lost.
Oh, that's
that
too bad.
tells us that she was almost certainly buried in secret by her closest followers. And we'll come on to what happened to her shortly. But also that people by that time didn't know where it was, because they're going to random tombs from the 12th dynasty, assuming that may be her place of burial, and paying respects to her. And it's quite clearly not her tomb. And they're leaving messages, saying, bless you, whatever. And so, you've got a situation here where she's already being forgotten about and her deeds are being forgotten. The other thing is that the king list started to leave her out. Not all, I must point out, but certainly some. And the evidence of this can be found at Abydos in the southern part of Egypt. I mean, most people, who viewers out there will know Abydos because it's where you get this incredible megalithic structure known as the Assyrian. Now, the Assyrian's out the back of the main temple of the king that built it, who is Seti I. And as you go through the temple to go out towards the Assyrian, there's a huge wall, and it's got the royal cartouches, like these ovals containing the names of the kings. And there's a whole long line of them from, the early dynasties right the way through to the age of Seti. And Seti's there pointing like this with his young son, who's going to be the future Ramesses II, and basically saying, look, son, you're going to join this list eventually after me, obviously after I die. So, I mean, this is a beautiful thing to see. But the thing is that when you actually look at who's on that list, they end after Sobekneferu's brother's reign, but they ignore her and do not pick up again until the first king of the 18th dynasty, which is one of these two brothers by the name of Ahmose. Now, I can understand why they might not want to have put all the kings of this dark age of Egyptian history, which we know as the Second Intermediate Period, but there's no reason why they should not have had Sobekneferu, unless they decided that she was the cause of all of this problem. And in other words, the role that she played had now become reversed. She was not the saviour of Egypt, which she unquestionably was, but she was now the person that had allowed it to collapse. And that's why she was no longer to be spoken about. And that's why, almost certainly, that her place of burial was completely lost by this time. So, that's the situation. And I think that in many ways, her story has to be told, because even though she gets a few pages in books on general history of Egyptian kings, nobody has ever written a biography of her before. This book is her first biography. It tells everything about her from her early days right the way through to how she might have died, and also the different temples and monuments and pyramids that may well have been connected with her. For instance, it would seem as if a pyramid was constructed for her, one of two, at a place called Mesguna, which is just to the south of the pyramid field of Dashur, where you have these pyramids relating to the Fourth Dynasty of the Pharaoh Sneferu, who is the father of Khufu, the constructor of the Great Pyramid. And you had two pyramids built at Mesguna, both of which, by the way, were destroyed in antiquity, absolutely destroyed completely, piece by piece. And so it's not them, clearly, but but that is pyramids. And the thing is that one of the pyramids at Mesguna was being built for her brother, the other one for her. Now, the one for her has got a lot of strange things connected with it, to do with its orientation, the fact that its interior is made of pure quartzite, which is covered in red. It's been painted red in areas even that were not aesthetic. In other words, this was not simply either practical, religious, aesthetic. The redness was in areas that was clearly going to be covered up immediately things were put in place. So, there's some really odd features of this which need explaining, and I think has got a lot to do with her and what her religious beliefs and magical beliefs were all about, which were completely different, I think, to a lot of other of the pharaohs that had reigned up till this time. But what seems to have happened is that even though her brother's tombs had a burial, now whether it was of him, we don't know, but it was certainly ransacked before it was destroyed, because there is evidence of that within its superstructure. But her pyramid, of which the superstructure was still in place and was investigated in 1910 by a British Egyptologist by the name of Ernest Mackay. Nobody had ever been placed inside that pyramid. It was clean completely. So it's very clear that she herself did not she did not reach the pyramid. She was buried somewhere in secret, almost certainly by her followers. All the indications are that she committed what we might call ritual death or suicide. And there's a very good reason for this, because I think that she upset a lot of people, not just because of her political views of obviously, shutting the borders, stamping her authority, but I think that she upset some of the priesthoods as well. One in particular I would point the finger at, and that's the priesthood of Ra, the sun god at Heliopolis, because they had originally had a lot of power. So many kings are named, something or other Ra, like Khafre, which is Khafra, one of the kings of the 4th dynasty who built the pyramids at Giza, Menkaura, and various other ones, shows the influence of this particular priesthood, and they retained that importance right the way through to the Middle Kingdom, which is the period the dynasty, the dynasties of Sobekneferu and whatever. That's known as the Middle Kingdom. And then suddenly they started losing them. Firstly, to the cult of Amun, which was based in Luxor, in the southern part of the country. This suddenly became the cult, the religious cult of choice for pharaohs, which is why so many of the kings of the 12th dynasty were Amun, Emet, the first, second, the third, the fourth, etc. Even the other ones, other than her, of course, honoured the wife of Amun, which, was it? Oh, I can't remember now. I'll come back to it in a second. But anyway, so in other words, they honoured quite clearly the cult of Amun and his wife. But then, of course, you've got Sobek. Now, Sobek was an incredibly ancient god of Egypt. It was probably worshipped, or he was probably worshipped in pre-dynastic time, so before 3000
And that's
BC.
crocodile, correct?
Yeah. Now, he's a crocodile god, but he's not just any old crocodile god. I mean, the people of the Middle Kingdom saw Sobek as the first incarnation of the sun god, because for them, what they believed, and this was against what was believed that the cult center of the god Ra, which is at Heliopolis, what they believe is that each night when the sun set, it would go into the waters of this huge lake, which was the center focus of this area called the Fayum Oasis, which is about 60 miles to the southwest of Cairo. And he would take the form of a crocodile and swim through the waters overnight, and then first thing in the morning would go up onto the banks of the lake and assume the form of the sun again, and then rise throughout the day. And what it was believed is that the first incarnation of the sun god was Sobek himself. So, they saw him as the first god, the first creator,
Wow.
but that he had a mother. And that mother was the goddess Neith. Now, Neith, once again, was an incredibly ancient goddess of Egypt. I mean, her main cult center was in the Nile Delta, a place called Sayaz. But she was also venerated a lot in the Fayum Oasis. And she was the mother of Sobek, and often the two of them are shown together because Neith is shown as a hippopotamus, a standing hippopotamus, and Sobek is shown actually literally on the back of this hippopotamus. And this was a figure not only shown in religious texts, but also it was a sky figure, showing that it had a celestial form. And that celestial form was made up of 3 different constellations of the northern sky that turned each night about the northern celestial pole. And those 3 constellations were Draco, the celestial dragon, also known as Typhon, or Typhon in Greek tradition, Ursa Minor, and also Ursa Major. And Ursa Major was attached to this, this collective sky figure. And on the hippopotamus had 7 stars down its, not its arm, as I'm pointing here, but it's like this long headdress. There you go. Well done for finding that. And you can see these 7 dots, which are 7 stars, which I'm pretty certain represent the 7 stars of Ursa Major. And the other dot that's on the shoulder probably represents the turning point of the heavens, the northern celestial pole. And although what's just out of shot here at the end of the hand of the hippopotamus is this device, like this instrument, and that is a thigh bone. or a thigh that is made up of the stars of Ursa Major. So basically, what's being shown here is that the hippopotamus, collectively with the crocodile, is the force, the dynamic force that's turning the heavens. And it would seem as if this is what was of interest to Sobekneferu. And even though it had been there with her predecessors, she took it on to a new level. I mean, she made Sobek the state god, and not only did she make him the state god, but also she created, or finished off, or is probably the correct term, or transformed this massive great complex in the Fayum, in an area known as Hawara, this monument that has come down to us under the name the Labyrinth. This is the original labyrinth, supposedly even earlier than the one at Crete. And this was this huge, great building structure, which the Greek historian Herodotus, who is known as the father of history, visited in around 450 BC. And he described it as more magnificent than the Great Pyramids of Giza. And he also said that there was as much of it underground as there were above ground. And he said that in the underground, apparently there were whole chambers of crocodiles and stuff like this. So it's very clear that this was a huge complex associated with Sobek. And the
I don't know if this is it. I don't know if that's the picture.
Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, that's obviously a very fanciful
version
of what it looks like, based very roughly on the description that was given by Herodotus, and obviously other classical writers, although really only a couple of them did actually visit it.
That's
personally.
amazing.
One of whom was Herodotus. And I mean, we don't know exactly what it looks like, because when the first archaeologists got there at the early part of the 19th century, it was just, huge fields of debris, basically. I mean, one of the first archaeologists to look at it was Carl Lepsius, an explorer, archaeologist, early Egyptologist from Germany. And then towards the end of the 19th century, Flinders Petrie, very famous British Egyptologist, got out there, and he continued the work uncovering the labyrinth, both of which wrote reports and books that cover the subject in full. But what's very clear is that the labyrinth was started by Sobekneferu's father, Amenemhet III, but was then transformed into something else by Sobekneferu. Actually, what you've got there is a sphinx that was found at Beirut in the Lebanon.
Oh, really?
Has a cartouche of Amenemhet the Fourth, not the third, but the fourth.
Oh, this is the fourth.
Huh?
You said this one's the fourth.
Yeah. The
fourth.
Got it. Found in Beirut, near Beirut, from what I know. But the importance about that sphinx is that it's one of the clues that we've got that Sobekneferu's brother was turning completely away from not just the cult of Sobek, but also the area of the Fayum, which was, the center of the 12th Dynasty kings, including Sobekneferu. And because it would seem as if he had aligned himself with the cult of Ra at Heliopolis, which was the same cult that was now being favored by the Semitic peoples who were coming and settling in the area of Heliopolis. So very clearly, they were becoming very important to this cult center, and quite clearly they were supporting the Semitic peoples, and Semitic peoples were beginning to support them. So that was giving them a certain amount of power and influence, which they had lost for a long time. And Amenemhet IV was also aligned with the cult center at Heliopolis. And it would seem his plans were to create a brand new kingdom outside of Egypt as we know it, in the Sinai, centered around this religious site known as Serabat el-Qadam, which was dedicated to the goddess Hathor. And it was very close to where all of this copper and malachite and turquoise was found, which again was very important to the economy of Egypt. But he was going to set up a brand new kingdom there and totally abandon the area of the Pharaoh. So he could only have done that with the absolute massive support of the Semitic peoples. You know, clearly the people who were in control of the Sinai. I mean, you know, they were the people that were aiding the Egyptians in doing all the mining operations and the movement of all of these minerals back into Egypt. They controlled those caravan routes, those caravan trades. So they themselves were very, very influential. And this was one of the things which, as I said, became so apparent during Sobekneferu's reign, that Egypt was losing control and the young king was being influenced by, you know, not only the old retainers from his father's reign, but also those Semitic peoples that were now in points of authority during his own reign. And one of the reasons that we know this is because even though there's very little about all of this in historical documents from Egypt, there are references in Greek and also in Arab texts from Egypt, from the very early stages of the Middle Ages, that clearly had come down from Coptic Christian sources. In other words, the people that took over from the dynastic Egyptians once Christianity, you know, took hold during Roman times. So in other words, they were retaining age-old traditions, the language, and even though they were Christian, they still told the folk stories that were there from dynastic times. And I mean, firstly, let's talk about the Arab stories, because they revolve around the figure of Joseph. Now, Joseph, he's the biblical character from the book of Genesis. You know, we know the story. He has this technicolored dream coat, and you know, he's favored by his father Jacob, and his brothers are jealous, and they throw him down a pit and leave him to die. Or in other accounts, they sell him to to these Arab peoples, and they take him into Egypt and they sell him. And you know, eventually, the wife of the guy in charge of the household, whose name is Potiphar, you know, she accuses him of coming on to her, although this was trumped up charges. He gets thrown into prison, but then they realize he's got this ability to be able to translate dreams. And the Pharaoh has this dream about these 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows, and feels this is prophetic. So they call Joseph, and he says, look, you know, there's going to be 7 years of where, you know, you're going to be prosperous, and then another 7 years where you're going to have a famine. So you've got to stock up, you know, so you can feed people when all this happens. And of course, this is exactly what occurs. Now, that's the Bible story. But the Arab stories, which actually match what the Greeks say, is that there were massive engineering works going on at the time of Joseph to build a canal from the Nile into the Pharaoh. And this did indeed take place. It took place during the reign of Amenemhet III, or certainly it was finished during reign. I mean, it may have been started before his reign, but it was certainly finished, and he is noted for his connection with it. It is known that Semitic peoples were involved in that engineering project. So it's very clear that the Arab accounts that say that Joseph was responsible for creating that canal is a memory of these engineering projects during the time of Amenemhet III, and clearly during the age of Sobekneferu and her brother. So in other words, Joseph, who we don't need to see as a single figure, I think he's a composite character, probably made up from certain important, probably Semitic, officials at the time. I mean, he may have been an individual, but he's probably made up of more than one person. He's what we call a composite character or composite figure. And what it says is that the Pharaoh at the time said, look, whilst you're building this canal, could you also build a royal palace in the Fayum for my daughter? And the way that the daughter is described, it's very obvious that it's Sobekneferu and not her sister. It's clearly Sobekneferu. So that means that Joseph knew Sobekneferu. And I mean, I'm not the only person to say this. My colleague, David Roll, an Egyptologist who's written various books, also talks about Joseph, living during the age of Amenemhet III, Amenemhet IV, and Sobekneferu. And David even suggests that Joseph may have been around for the reigns of the first two kings of the 13th dynasty, who we know are somehow part of this royal family. So you've got that, but the important point of saying this is that according to the Bible story, Joseph, I should say Joseph's keeper, Potiphar, is the high priest of Heliopolis. And that is really, really crucial statement, because it's quite clear that that's the priesthood that was backing Joseph. And what happens is that after Joseph becomes this prophet, but is able to interpret these dreams, he becomes the most important person in Egypt after the Pharaoh. And the title of that character is Vizier. And the Vizier basically controls the country, controls all the officials, controls the administration of all of the different districts. And so he's a very powerful character. So if he did know Sobekneferu, not only is he now possibly Vizier, but he's also there on behalf of the priesthood of Heliopolis, the priests of Ra there. And they're the people that come up against her. Now, I'm not therefore pointing fingers at Joseph, because I don't think it works that way. But what I do think is that he may, if he was a character, we can almost imagine him coming to Sobekneferu and saying, look, things are beginning to go wrong in the country because of your reign, or certainly that's the way people are seeing it. And, I strongly suggest to you that you turn things back to the way that they were when your brother was in charge. Otherwise, they're going to come for you. And when he says they, he means the priests of Heliopolis are going to create propaganda that will allow people to rise up against her. The other problem that Sobekneferu had at this time was that she reigned for 4 years. And we certainly know that in the third year of her reign, the Nile waters were very low. And when this happens, what used to occur before the building of the Nasser Dam, was it the Aswan Dam, was that the waters would flow into Egypt, flow down into the Nile Delta, and they would drown, literally, to start with, the low-lying regions of the valleys. But they would leave behind, once the waters receded, this rich, dark soil, basically, which is one of the reasons why Egypt was known as the Black Land, because of this rich soil that would be left because of the inundation every year. And if these floods were not high enough, they would not be able to reach out into the valleys, and that meant famine the following year. It would mean that the seeds could not be properly planted the following year, and this could lead to famine. And when you had these sort of problems, and this is written about by certain Egyptologists, the pharaohs would be blamed, because their contact with the gods was quite clearly failing. And because of this, fingers would be pointed, and they would be expected either to rectify it immediately, or be killed, or kill themselves. In other words, commit suicide. And again, this would almost certainly have been one of the excuses that they would have had to point the finger towards Sobekneferu and say, look, you're doing bad things. Clearly the country is failing because of you and because of your Sobek cult and whatever else it is you're doing. And, your policies, get out, basically. or will come for you. And I think that what happened was that she chose ritual death instead of basically being dragged through the streets and, and eventually killed. And of course, remember, this echoes exactly what happened to Cleopatra.
Right.
Because after Mark Antony was killed, she commits suicide. This is after the Battle of Actium, I think in AD 30 BC. Sorry, not AD 30 BC. And they were coming for her, and she took that route out. And I mean, we would call it suicide today, but they would have seen it as walking into death, quite literally. And although the evidence all points towards this, we've got an added element coming in from Greek tradition here, because Herodotus talks about an Egyptian female pharaoh named Nitocris. And what he says of her story is that her brother, the king, was murdered, and that she took revenge on those that murdered him by creating this banquet inside the palace, creating a channel from the Nile. And then once they were all, eating their dinner, she flooded the room with waters and killed them all. But then afterwards, so that she herself would not suffer retribution, she threw herself into a room full of hot ashes. Now, that's what Herodotus tells us. So what the hell is going on here? How can you unpack that? I mean, firstly, if she was involved with killing her brother, why would she then, take revenge on those that had killed her? Well, quite clearly, this is her mopping up after the death of her brother. She might be pointing fingers at people, but all she's doing is getting rid of those that she sees as a threat to her own reign. And that also explains why there's this line about her throwing herself into this room full of hot ashes, so she herself does not suffer retribution. What is this room of hot ashes? Well, almost certainly it's some kind of adaton, which is like this secret chamber that would be used for rituals, which could either be underground, perhaps tucked away in the corner of a palace, where you would go to communicate both with the ancestors and also with the gods themselves. So, in other words, like a personal temple in a way.
Right.
And what are the hot ashes? The hot ashes are almost certainly incense that's burning, and that incense would have been hallucinogenic, in my opinion, and from from the story that I've pieced together. And these would have put a person into an altered state of consciousness. But I also suggest you probably ingested other, psychotropic or psychoactive substances that would have done the job. These are the sorts of drugs that if you take in the wrong measures, you're going to die.
Of course, right.
And that's exactly what happened to Cleopatra. I mean, the whole story of Cleopatra and the snake is just a pure metaphor for her taking or intaking drugs. And scholarly papers have been written about this in recent years. It's even been suggested what hallucinogens that she used. And I think that this was the easy way out for these pharaohs. So why did Sobekneferu kill herself at this time? I think because she thinks she'd done her job, and she'd restored what the ancient Egyptians referred to as Ma'at, which means divine order in the country. Truth, justice, and divine order. In other words, she'd done what she needed to do. She felt that she'd done enough to allow Egypt to survive and to prosper eventually. So she just basically said goodbye and allowed the 13th dynasty to begin.
Wow.
And of course, that's exactly what did happen. But the problem is that although she was the savior of ancient Egypt, she was eventually maligned and seen as the cause of this dark age known as the Second Intermediate Period. So then what happens is that we know virtually nothing about her from that age onwards until the 19th century. when archaeologists start, excavating different parts of Egypt, particularly in the Fayum, particularly in the area of the Labyrinth, a very famous place. What the image on the left is an interesting one. It's one of the only statues that's considered to be of Sobekneferu. Now, I've reconstructed her face, simply to see what it would have looked like. You can see the results of that, not only in the book, but also on the front cover. For some reason, the publishers decided to use that on the front of it. That's an artist impression of Sobekneferu that was done by an artist friend of mine by the name of Russell Hussein. I think is a great image, brilliant image. He did various other ones for the book as well. And I'm going to say that was probably a good likeness. We're back to the same image again on the right there. The cartouche on the left is actually, the one on there's two there. The one on the right is actually that of Sobekneferu. You can see the three, instruments here, which are symbols of beauty. That's Neferu, and then above you can see the crocodile, and that represents obviously the Sobek himself, the god, amazing. Basically. But the importance of the fact that all of this stuff started to be refound in the 19th century is that the Egyptologists started saying, "Who is this woman?" She clearly ruled the country. She clearly was related to, Amenemhet III. She clearly was involved with reconstructing the labyrinth, even though I think that her role in that was actually suppressed by the archaeologists, because this was a woman doing incredible things in the 19th,
Well, and I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you about that. Father. Being the first female, I was curious, being the first of anything sometimes can get the backlash, I'm surprised that they even allowed that to happen in the first place. That's a different story in its own right, because it would seem as if her father, Amenemhet III, decided that his daughter Nefertari would rule the country, and we know this because her name was allowed to be placed within a cartouche. Okay, now that was a first, completely a first, right? And that said that she was obviously being lined up, but the estimations, the evidence that I give in the book shows that she could have been no more than 16 to 18. Right.
Okay. So what he thought was, let's marry her with her younger brother.
Right.
The future Amenemhet IV. And, together they'll rule the country. That seems to have been, for him, a sensible idea. But then Nefertari mysteriously dies, even before her father. Okay? And we know this because a makeshift tomb for her was created alongside that, actually inside her father's pyramid at Hawara, which is next to the labyrinth. It's just a makeshift stuff, and it was clearly there so her body could be placed there on a temporary basis until her own little pyramid had been built about a kilometre away from there, and eventually that was built and her remains were transferred to there. So we know that the plans had been thrown into chaos. This had not been expected. This young daughter of 16 to 18 suddenly dies. So what's going to happen? And as I said, Sobekneferu steps into her sister's shoes. Now, I think, it's difficult to know how old Sobekneferu was at this time, but the suggestion is that she was slightly older than her brother. So let's say her brother was, 16 to 18 as well. Right. She was maybe 18 to 20. And the reason why she was overlooked, I think, is because she was from a different mother, not the original royal wife. And it was obviously a royal wife or consort who was second in favour, not of primary importance. So for some reason, she was overlooked. Sobekneferu was overlooked. And now what happened to the sister is obviously a matter of speculation. Did she die accidentally? Did she die through some kind of illness? Or was she murdered? You know, the third option, the fact she was murdered, has to be looked at as a very, very real possibility. And although we cannot point fingers, the only person that benefited from her death was Sobekneferu, because obviously she jumped into her shoes at that point. But as I said, you know, that's pure speculation,
right.
And you know, perhaps we shouldn't be pointing fingers. but so that's the situation. And of course, then Sobekneferu, I think, rules either officially or unofficially with her brother. They get on fine for a few years, and then they fall out. But anyway, let's take this story right up to the present day.
Yeah, please.
Because what happens is that by about the mid-19th century, certain more speculative writers of Egyptology are looking at Sobekneferu and saying, this is a very interesting woman. Not only is she a pharaoh in her own right, but she is clearly reviving a very ancient cult of Egypt associated with the crocodile god, who also becomes associated with a god that's seen as a trickster god known as Set, who was the guy that tricked his brother Osiris into a tomb and threw it in the Nile and killed his brother. But also she's venerating the hippopotamus god, who we know under the name of Neith. And these are very, very ancient star cult gods, basically, star gods. And one of the writers of this was a guy called Bruges Bay, Heinrich Bruges. He writes about it in his books, and this is picked up on by a writer by the name of Gerald Massey. And he writes various speculative books on ancient Egypt and how they're linked with cults in other parts of the world. He goes on and on about Sobekneferu, and he talks about the hippopotamus goddess as the mother of Sobek, as basically the great mother of time, but also continually refers to as the goddess of the seven stars because of her association with Ursa Major. And it would seem as if an Irish novelist read Gerald Massey's books. This is right at the end of the 19th century, and thought, do you know what? This Sobekneferu would be a great character for an Egyptian novel. And that Irish writer is Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker, of course, more well known for his book Dracula,
right?
Which, by the way, was not a huge hit when it was first released.
Right.
I mean, it only gained momentum, you know, as the decades went on. And so he wrote a book that was published in 1903 called The Jewel of Seven Stars. And the antagonist was this ancient Egyptian female by the name of Queen Tera, Tera. By the way, that meant time. Certainly that's the way that that Bram Stoker would have seen it, because this is something that had been written about by Gerald Massey, the term Tera meaning time. But also it's the word terror as well. So it's, you know, installs a sense of terror. And this queen, let's call her that, comes back from the dead and wreaks havoc in the modern world. And the book that Bram Stoker writes was seen to be so shocking to the Edwardian audience at the time that the publishers called him back in and said, look, Bram, you know, for future editions, mate, you've got to change this. You know, everybody's got to live happily ever after at the end of it, all right? Which wasn't the case with the first edition. But of course, what happens is that this is the story that's picked up and used in so many horror films where an Egyptian female mummy comes back to life and wreaks havoc. You know, the most recent of which was 2017's The Mummy, featuring, or starring, I should say, Tom Cruise. These are all based on The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. All of them are. And I mean, if you want to, you know, look any of these films up, the best one came out in 1980 and it's called The Awakening. And that is the best by far. A lot of it's actually filmed in Egypt. and it's the best possible representation of Bram Stoker's Jewel of Seven Stars. So, when you watch that, just be aware that the female antagonist in there, the ancient Egyptian queen or ruler, is Sobekneferu.
That's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. Well, our time's getting very short, but I do have a couple questions. I always tell people in the chat room they're my co-host, and they do have a couple questions. If you don't mind answering a few before we can leave. Well, one we was kind of back when we were talking about it, and this was from Anthony. He said, first of all, he loves Africa and history of Egypt, but he says, how many cults were in Egypt at that time during her reign?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you got to remember that each different center, if you like, had its own religious cult revolving around its own god or family of gods. Right. And the most important of those at the time was Amun at Luxor, Sobek in the Fayum, Ra, and also Atum, who was the creator form of Ra, at Heliopolis. You had Hathor, whose main center was at Dendera, but also in the Sinai at Seribat al-Qadam. And you'd have had similar, cult centers all over the country.
Right.
And all of them relate to probably extremely ancient deities who would have been venerated there all the way along. And of course, some of them rise to prominence, some of them are taken over and called under the name of a more familiar god or goddess. Some of them relate to particular dynasties of kings, like, for instance, Amun rises up towards the end of the 11th dynasty when, because they particularly favoured it, they were a particularly strong dynasty, and they then pass on the importance of Amun to the 12th dynasty, which is why it becomes so important. And, as one cult rises up, another one will go down in importance. And I mean, let's say, for instance, at the time of Akhenaten created his own religion, a monotheistic religion of the Atun, A-T-N, which was basically revolved around the sun disk. And the cult of Amun were denigrated into of no importance whatsoever. So they obviously got seriously peed off about that. And so they then tried to get people to support them and take out Akhenaten and his family, which eventually happened, as we know, probably around the time of the reign of Tutankhamun.
Right.
So this is what happens constantly, is that the different cults rise and fall.
And then one more, and then unfortunately we're out of time, but Maggie was asking, and it is curious because, every time people do research for their books or TV shows or whatever, or even just research for a thesis, but what was the most interesting thing that you discovered about our Pharaoh writing this book?
Sobekneferu. Well, I mean, I think, firstly, when we've not gone into this, but behind your head, I think everybody can see this, is a megalithic temple at a place called Kaza El Saga. It's on the north side of the Fayum. This is the most enigmatic temple in the whole of the country. And even though there's good evidence to suggest that it dates to the Old Kingdom, in other words, it's probably contemporary with the pyramids, there seems to be no question that its interior was redesigned by Sobekneferu. I actually find 2 pieces of hieroglyphic evidence attaching her with this site that have never, ever been publicly made known before. So those are in the book. And the reason why that particular temple is so important is because that whole area has evidence of human activity going back several thousand years. This area was seen as the place of the ancestors by the 12th Dynasty kings, including Sobekneferu. That's why she took so much interest in it. That place is known, even to this day, as the place of the crocodiles, or the Temple of the Crocodiles. And if you're interested in coming along with us to Egypt. We're there in November. We're going to go in search of Sobekneferu. So all the details of that tour, which we do with Hugh Newman and Megalithomania, is on andrewcollins.com. So just come onto my website. The address is there. And, you can obviously read about Sobekneferu. You can read about the tours, not only to Egypt, but also to Turkey. And our next big conference in the UK is Origins in November. But I shall see some of you at Gaia-Sphere in Boulder, Colorado in August. Also got a big thing in Nashville with the Edgar Casey Foundation people in October. So hope to see some of you there.
Well, you did it again. You wrote an amazing book about an amazing pharaoh that was not well known, or most people maybe not even heard her name before. So thank you for bringing it to our attention and bringing her back to life. And again, we hope one day we'll all get to go with you on one of your tours. And so go to andrewcollins.com.
Thank you.
But thank you, Andrew, again for being with us. And hopefully you'll come back again very, very soon.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in for Truth Be Told. We so appreciate you supporting us and sharing this show and liking it and leaving amazing comments. And thank you for people like Andrew for doing the work that we get to bring and share with you. I'm just one of you. I learn from these amazing genius authors and researchers, and we really appreciate it. So make sure you tune in every Monday for Robert Hensley does the MINUTEMAN Report. Bonnie Burkert does her Truth Be Told Transformation on Wednesdays at 3. And then, of course, my show every Friday at 3 o'clock. And then for Espanol listeners, we have Metaphor doing Truth Be Told in Spanish on Tuesdays at 3. So, but until next time, we love you guys, and we'll see you again soon. See you next week. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media. Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio. Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.